Gaius Sallustius Crispus, Praetor 46 BCE. Better known to Anglophone students of Rome as Sallust, Gaius Sallustius Crispus in his own time was yet another controversial young senator who was constantly embroiled in scandal. The discrepancy between his behavior and his old-fashioned high-minded rhetoric no doubt made him an object of ridicule in the eyes of many. A partisan of Caesar, Sallust was expelled for moral turpitude by the censors of 50 BCE. Thus he had to begin his career again from scratch when Caesar crossed the Rubicon the following year and reinstated him. As a commander in Caesar's service, Sallust faced danger, but ultimately did very little of note. Rewarded with the governorship of Africa Nova, Sallust found himself once more at the center of a scandal. Put on trial for corruption upon his return, Sallust gained acquittal, but lost his appetite for politics. Thus, in late 45 or early 44, Sallust did something that for a politician is truly unthinkable. He retired. When his former mentor was murdered within months or perhaps even weeks of his retirement, Sallust stayed retired. However, his was not an idle retirement. Sallust devoted the last 10 years of his life to writing history. In the process, he set a new standard for Roman historiography, influencing later Latin language texts on the past, not unlike how Thucydides transformed history writing among the Greeks. Today we'll look at how an utterly unremarkable political failure reforged himself into one of the best historians of antiquity. Sallust was not the scion of a patrician or noble plebeian family. Thus his name would have been rather unfamiliar to the voters of Rome. He was a new man, much like Cicero. He was born in Sabine country, or at least he hailed from there. Most likely he was born in his family's ancestral home at Amiternum, where they had been, probably for many generations, the family of note in town. However, it's also possible that by this time his family had relocated to Rome itself, and that he was actually born in a house in the city of Rome. We really don't know, and I suppose it doesn't matter too much, but suffice it to say that he would have still been able to get voters out of Amiternum to show up for him in Rome when elections were held. As a new man, he must have been well off enough to hold a Senate seat, and there was a property requirement. Elections were also increasingly expensive. That being said, we don't have any specific details about his level of wealth or that of most senators. Based on context, though, and some of the details of his life later, I'm guessing that he was actually more well off than most. And remember, the senators are all in the very, very upper echelon of income, but among them there still was quite a bit of variance, and that really mattered when you were running for election, and these elections are getting increasingly and outrageously expensive. So most likely he was more well off than most, but we don't really know. We also know that he must have received a first flight education because his writing is quite learned. He was an excellent stylist, and he clearly knew the past very well. He was excellent at rhetoric, and this means that he was someone who clearly took his education very seriously. Now, any member of the upper class from the equestrian order on up had access to about the same level of education, so that's not really that helpful in determining how wealthy he was, but among the students in class, Sallust would have been one of the more serious and devoted of his group of students he was with. Roman elites who wished to go into politics would take their education seriously, as Sallust had, at least in the realm of rhetoric, and then they would be eligible to run for office by around the age of 28 to 30, depending on their birth and all of that. So for Sallust, he'd have been closer to 30. This put him entering politics in the early 50s, by which I mean around 57 or 56, because remember, we're counting BCE. This put him squarely in the early years of the First Triumvirate, at a time when Caesar was beginning to have some friction with Pompey and Crassus, his fellow triumvirs. Awkwardly enough, Sallust decided to go partisan at this early date, and he actually was hostile to Pompey. Now, this was awkward because Caesar and Pompey were currently in-laws. Pompey was married to Caesar's daughter, and having people like Sallust around would have made reconciliation a little bit harder, although of course he did not prevent it, as the triumvirate was renewed around 55. Also with Sallust politics, he was someone who does seem to have had an independent mind, much like Curio the Younger and a number of other Romans who we normally think of as political operatives and partisans, but many of them actually did have a lot more complexity to their political thought. And we see this in Sallust's own writings where he admires Caesar, but also a man who was bent on Caesar's destruction, the man most unlike Caesar, Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger. And so Sallust had politics that perhaps held a little bit too much nuance for your average person, especially when there was a crisis afoot and people were looking for others to fall in line. So this may have been a problem for Sallust in terms of his ability to really build support. He tells us about his early career in his own writings, although he doesn't go into much detail. Most of the actual biographical details about how he performed in his various magistracies actually come from other sources, but he gives us a sort of brief preview of why he entered politics and then why he left. And what he tells us effectively is that when he was a young man and he first entered politics, that he was full of high hopes, that it was Mr. Smith goes to Rome. And he thought he was going to make a positive impact and make the world a better place, but over time he lost faith in the Republic and in the men who lead it. And his essential claim was that the immorality of others was perverting the process, and he refers to the greed and corruption and incompetence of his fellow senators, and how bent they were on destroying each other at any cost and putting their own ambitions first and foremost. We'll get into his own morality in just a minute, because it turns out that maybe what he was really mad about is that he thought he had gone into Rome with this great well of ancestral virtue and he had been corrupted by the city. We'll see. We know he's elected quaestor probably around 55 or so, perhaps. That would have made him a senator, and then he also was elected tribune in 52. And that would have put him in office not too long after the murder of Clodius. So this would have been a time when the tribunes would have been especially important, although this also would have brought him into conflict with Pompey, because Pompey was the guy who helped to restore order as sole consul after the murder of Clodius. And it was around this time that Sallust would receive his first major political setbacks, and a lot of that, as we'll see, was his own fault. So let's get into that. Antagonizing a great man like Pompey in a public forum is a great way to get attention for yourself, but it's also a great way to attract the wrong kind of attention from the person you're attacking. And Pompey, through his various lieutenants, often went after his opponents. So everything that Sallust did that was a little bit off color was exposed, and many in Rome were aware of what he did in his personal time. One thing that Sallust did was to visit the home of an older senator named Publius Nigidius Figulus, who was a Pythagorean, that is to say he believed in the school of Pythagoras, which held a number of religious views that were somewhat unusual in the eyes of the Romans. The Pythagoreans, for instance, tended to be vegetarian, and they also had doctrines on the soul and things of that nature. So he went there, and supposedly, the rumor goes, there was a religious ceremony. Now, in theory, the Romans believe in freedom of religion, but in practice, they only believe in it when convenient. And so, since Sallust had powerful enemies who wanted to see him go down, he was attacked over his involvement in this. And in fact, he was put on trial twice for impiety in connection to one single dinner party / ceremony. Both times he was able to secure acquittal, as was typically normal when it came to charges of impiety, which tended to fail. But still, it put his name out there in a way that was not altogether positive. He also had an affair with a married woman, in this case, a very famous married woman, Fausta, the daughter of Sulla, the former dictator from when he was a child. Now, the problem with Fausta was not so much that her father had been a conservative dictator, but rather that her current husband, Titus Annius Milo, was a gang leader and a rather big individual in his own right. Sallust most likely was a bit of a nerd, and when Milo caught him in bed with his wife, he beat the crap out of him and then extracted a large payment in order to keep it all hush-hush and not take him to court. So Sallust probably was well off, as I mentioned earlier, and he should count himself lucky that Milo decided to just let this pass and let him be on his way. Most likely Milo did spread the story around to embarrass Sallust at a later date because Milo was a friend of Pompey. And there's even a chance that Milo set him up for this so he could beat him up a little bit and extract some money. But at any rate, what we see is that Sallust's early career was not really that distinguished in that he fell short of the high ideals that he liked to espouse. Oftentimes, young politicians for a little bit can actually adhere to the things that they preach, but with Sallust it appears that big city life got to him pretty early, and that he was never quite the exemplar of old Roman morality that he wished to portray himself as. Every 5 years, the Romans would elect 2 former consuls as censors. They did a whole lot of different things, including passing infrastructure bills, but their most famous work was to revise the roles of the Senate to prevent it from getting too big. The Senate at this time was limited to 600 members, and the censors would look for unproductive backbenchers to cut, or people who they felt were unworthy of continuing. And so they usually would prune the Senate of troublesome younger magistrates. Unfortunately for Sallust, he was one of those. The 2 censors of the year were Appius Claudius Pulcher and Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus. Piso was Caesar's father-in-law, and if he were anything like Caesar's cousin Lucius Julius Caesar, he would be someone who was a relatively reliable ally, someone who could be a protector. Perhaps Piso didn't really like Sallust that much because when Claudius went after him, Piso either could not or did not do anything. By the way, Appius Claudius Pulcher is the older brother of the famous street gang leader Publius Clodius Pulcher, but their politics were completely incompatible. So Appius Claudius Pulcher was a committed optimate. The reason Claudius gave for kicking Sallust out of the Senate was, again, moral turpitude. He cited the previous offenses of being impious and having the affair with Milo's wife. By this time, Milo had been exiled, by the way, for his role in Clodius's death. And so, Sallust was stricken from the rolls of the Senate. And the way this would work is that they would make a list of the Senate, a literal list, and people who were removed would simply not be on it. And so Sallust had his name removed. He did not appear on the new list, and thus, while he didn't really lose all that much aside from his seat in the Senate and the right to partake in meetings, he would now have to start from scratch. And so that's what he was determined to do. So apparently the flame of his political ambition was not quite doused by this, although I imagine a lot of people who were struck from the rolls decided to just call it quits altogether and never came back. But something would be a little bit different in Sallust's case because not long after he was stricken from the rolls, the civil war between Caesar and Pompey would break out. One has to imagine that because this was the great crisis that had been brewing for a few years, and because he was such a fan of Caesar and had such a deep hatred for Pompey, that he was extremely frustrated to be able to play no part in those debates. So, for obvious reasons, he wanted to get back in on the action. This was the moment, perhaps, that he thought he could finally distinguish himself and stand up for what he believed was right. In early 49 BCE, after the prolonged negotiations between Caesar and Pompey finally broke down, Caesar and a handful of his men crossed the Rubicon, Pompey fled to Greece, and with Pompey went the majority of the Senate. One of the first things that Caesar did in order to attract hopefully high-ranking supporters to his side was to recall all of the exiles who had been sent away over the last decade. And a number of men responded to the call and returned to Rome, and they accepted their offices back from Caesar. In the case of Sallust, he had not been exiled, though, and so he couldn't be restored and then promoted. He had to simply be reappointed altogether. And so Sallust, despite his loyalty, was only able to attain an office he had held several years earlier, the most junior office of quaestor. But this did put him back in the Senate. He didn't have to face another election to do it, and he would be able to gain a little bit of distinction because his role as quaestor would be to command a legion. He was also given a semi-independent command in northeast Italy. He was partnered with another junior magistrate, Lucius Minucius Basilis. Each one of them had a legion, and it appears that neither one of them was in charge of the other, at least so far as we know. Their role was to work under Caesar's nephew, Gaius Antonius, the younger brother of the more famous Mark Antony. But Antonius's legion got separated from them on the island of Charicta. And to reach it, it was off the coast of what is now Croatia, they would need a fleet. The problem is that the Adriatic fleet had gone with Pompey. And so the Pompeians were able to cut off the Caesarians on the island. Gaius Antonius and his men were captured, or I should say the men declared for Pompey, and then Gaius Antonius was captured. And so both Sallust and Minucius were unable to accomplish their mission. And while Caesar doesn't seem to have outright chastised them for failure, I think he was annoyed by them. At least it seems that he most likely was annoyed by them because he doesn't really seem to have been that pleased by their comportment, even in that very limited capacity. But again, our evidence is a little bit short on this because Sallust doesn't really write about his own career, and also Caesar doesn't go into great detail or really lambast his subordinates when they fail. We don't hear too much else from Sallust over the next couple of years, but he reappears in late 47. He has already been designated as the Praetor for the following year, and so clearly he is still in Caesar's good graces, even if Caesar was most likely not altogether impressed by his conduct in northeast Italy. However, Caesar is still willing to put him to work, and the task before Sallust is now to deal with a mutinous legion. In Campania, which is an area to the south of Rome, one of the legions that had served under Caesar in Gaul and then fought in the Battle of Pharsalus was upset that Caesar had not yet paid up. He had promised them a big bonus before the battle, and he had yet to pay, although it had already been a year or more since the fighting took place. In fact, by late 47, that's about a year and a half after the Battle of Pharsalus. For context, Pharsalus in the summer of 48 was a battle where Caesar's men were very nearly annihilated. They had been pretty close to defeat at Dyrrhachium. They were then on the run. They were cornered at Pharsalus, and they only managed to cut their way out because they managed to regain the initiative due to a battlefield tactic that Caesar made. And so these men refused to do any further service, and they wanted their money now. Sallust was sent in to deal with them, and his promise was that they would be paid a large amount of money per man, so about 1,000 drachmae according to Appian. Appian, of course, is a Greek historian, so he used the Greek currency. So most likely think 1,000 denarii. And that's a pretty generous bonus, but the soldiers were not satisfied with that because they've already been waiting for a bonus of an unspecified amount. Now they're hearing the number, but they know that Caesar tends to move slowly when it comes to paying debts. So they want their money now. And we learn that Sallust then had to flee for his life because the men were very angry and they were very much willing to shoot the messenger in this case. So Sallust ran for his life, told Caesar what was happening. Caesar decided he needed to go and face them, and so he went, and they sort of ran into each other on the Campus Martius, the old marshalling grounds for the Roman army back when they had the conscription system. And this is the famous incident where Caesar will call them citizens rather than comrades or fellow soldiers. And then that will cause them to come to their senses. They start crying, and they all reconcile. Caesar pays them. But not all is well and good even then, because actually at least one of these formations refused to go to Africa. And I believe the mutinous legion in this case was actually the famous 10th Legion. So Caesar's best unit refused to go to Africa, but then did agree to go to Munda for the final campaign against Titus Labienus and Gnaeus Pompeius the Younger. So Sallust was involved in a major incident and almost died. We can't really say that he was ineffectual or incompetent in this instance because the fact is mutinous troops are very difficult to deal with in Roman history. If you look from this period forward, a whole lot of commanders were either arrested by their men, killed by them, or forced to declare themselves as rebels. And so dealing with mutinous troops was not a small task, and it really just highlights the charisma of Caesar and doesn't really say anything about Sallust at all. At the outset of the Civil War, as we mentioned, most of the senior senators went with Pompey. However, in the summer of 48, Caesar won the Battle of Pharsalus, and after that, most of those magistrates decided to accept Caesar's pardon and go back to Rome. However, some of them still remained obstinate, and they were determined to fight it out. Most of the guys who were determined to fight it out were old loyalists of the now dead Pompey, but there was one man who was still a consular, and therefore had the right to command, and that was Metellus Scipio. While Metellus Scipio was notoriously incompetent, he still did have a pretty formidable army. This army had had about 3 years to prepare. They knew the ground well. Many of the subordinate commanders in his army had a lot of cachet with the men, or they were competent, like Titus Labienus. And so, despite the fact that the supreme commander for the Pompeians was a total goof, their army strength was still such that Caesar could not take this campaign lightly. And so when Sallust became praetor in 46, he had to accompany Caesar rather than being left behind in Rome to manage the courts or run the cities or do some of the other duties praetors usually perform. But Sallust would not be really employed in a frontline role for this because Caesar's logistics would be a lot more difficult than those of his opponents. So North Africa, modern Tunisia, was pretty well set up for logistics, at least if you already had a strong foothold there, had control. But if you are invading it, you need a naval support system. And that is exactly what Sallust ran. He ran it from an offshore island at Kirkina, and then he supervised the import of food and supplies from Italy and Sicily, and then sent them forward to Caesar. And Caesar doesn't really tell us a great deal about this. In fact, ancient sources tend to be a little bit reticent about the particular details of military operations because they felt like it was a little bit boring and maybe just a little bit not gentlemanly enough. But apparently Sallust did pretty well in this role, and Caesar was fully satisfied with the work that he performed. In fact, he seems to have been very happy with Sallust because he was about to reward him with a major governorship that is usually considered to be one of the more difficult governorships in the Roman world at this time. The Battle of Thapsus in 46 was in many ways Caesar's most impressive victory, insofar as he effectively wiped out most of the remaining opposition to him in terms of officers. Although Titus Labienus and the Pompey brothers, Gnaeus and Sextus, got away, many of the other leading men in the Pompeian cause were either killed in action or they committed suicide to avoid capture. And that includes Cato the Younger, Metellus Scipio, the commander at Thapsus, and Marcus Petreius, who had been one of the best friends of the late Pompey the Great. Now, although that main battle had been won, there was still mop-up work to be done. The Numidians had mostly sided with the Pompeians, and so Caesar needed a couple of capable men to govern the two provinces in Africa and keep order here. And the man he put the heaviest burden on was Sallust. So apparently, again, he was very impressed with the job that Sallust had done providing supplies, and now he thought that he was ready for a real challenge. And so he made him the governor of Africa Nova. This is a proconsular governorship, meaning that it is an area where the man in charge needs to have a whole lot of authority and a lot of troops. Otherwise, he won't be able to perform his duties. Africa Nova was the name the Romans had assigned to the former kingdom of Numidia. So for a long time, this had been a Roman ally against the Carthaginians. And then that relationship had soured after the destruction of Carthage because Rome always soured on former allies and started seeing them as threats. And then, of course, Rome had annexed Numidia at a previous date. So this was indeed a challenging assignment. The province was not really that full of cities compared with the former Carthaginian part of Africa, which was the other province. It was also very large. There were a lot of nomads here, people like the Berbers. It was bordered by desert and mountains, so there were plenty of places that you had to patrol, plenty of places the Romans wouldn't be familiar with where an ambush could occur. And because of this, if we look at the governors before and after it, they are mostly men with a whole lot of military experience. And Sallust was the exception. He's someone whose military experience was, so far as we know, relatively minimal. Sure, he had commanded the legion and not done much before. He had then commanded the logistics for Caesar's army, but this is not someone who was a veteran of the Gallic Wars or someone who had held a proconsular or pro-praetorian governorship before where he had won a battle or two. So in many ways, Sallust may have had the training for this, but he had no real experience. So this was an assignment that was frankly above his head. Later on, he'll be accused of robbing the place blind, but it's also possible that because the Romans prefer to talk about corruption rather than incompetence, that the real problem with Sallust's governorship was not that he was avaricious, but that he was simply overwhelmed. Maybe he just couldn't keep up with all of the officials in the province and they did corruption, he had no way to control them. Or maybe he allowed Roman citizens here to get raided by outside nomads and he couldn't do anything about it. We don't really know. But I think there's a pretty good chance that rather than this being the case where Sallust was corrupt, that he simply was incapable of doing this particular job, and that the easiest way for his opponents to frame it in order to do the most damage was to claim that he was corrupt. Maybe to claim that he was in league with the enemy, or that he simply was too busy lining his own pockets to do his job correctly. But we'll never really know, because the details about Sallust's time as governor are very limited. The only things we can say with certainty about Sallust's time as the governor of Africa Nova is that it didn't go very well, he wasn't there very long, and it ended in a trial, which is absolutely not what you want to have someone say about your governorship. For Sallust to be put on trial, this would mean a couple of things. Firstly, the people bringing him to trial were almost certainly, or partially at least, some of the people bringing him to trial must have been fellow Caesarians. If this was simply a matter of men like Brutus and Cassius wanting to try him, even though they were technically in good standing with Caesar and had even been appointed as future consuls, they would probably not dare in this environment to go after a member of the Caesarian circle in an open way. So most likely the people taking Sallust to task were ostensible allies, maybe aligned in private with people who were not all that friendly with Caesar. We have to remember that by this time, many of the men who had opposed Caesar were dead or had been reconciled, at least officially, by being given offices. So again, many of the designated consuls for the next few years were actually men who had fought on the other side in the Civil War. But the main body of the Senate had very much been filled with Caesarian loyalists. In fact, a number of people who were now senators were people Caesar had met in Gaul. So about half the Senate at this point owed its position to Caesar. That means that Sallust must have really pissed someone off who, in theory, should be an ally. How did he do it? Well, it's possible he was corrupt, of course. That could be it. There were genuinely Romans in the Senate who believed in good government and wanted to discipline members of their own group. It's also possible that Sallust was a bit of a dick. He did have some moralizing tendencies with his rhetoric, and this was not an era where that kind of thing played very well. So this could be a matter of revenge. Sallust had long bemoaned the state of the Republic, and then apparently went and did a lot of the same practices he had been bemoaning, so maybe this was a matter of revenge. It's also possible that people were still angry with him over his supposed impiety. We simply don't really know. What we do know, though, is that not long after he came back from Numidia, he was put on trial and then acquitted. There is a spurious text we'll get into in a little bit called the Invective against Sallust, where the claim is that the only reason that Sallust got off in the trial was because he personally bribed Caesar with some of his ill-gotten gains. So the idea is that he went to the dictator and offered him 2 million sesterces if Caesar would make sure that the trial went his way. And again, we don't really know. We also don't really know how much of a bribe it would take to win Caesar over at this point, since by this time Caesar was incredibly wealthy and most likely would be difficult to bribe. So it's really hard to say. That being said, we do have some reason to think that either Sallust was born much wealthier than we realize, or that he actually did line his pockets pretty significantly in Africa, because he will now buy an estate in Rome called the Horti Sallustiani, the Sallustian Gardens. And this will be at the foot of the Quirinal Hill. This will become such an elaborate and famous estate, by the way, it still exists to this day, as you see in the picture, that later on the emperors will claim it as a personal residence. So from the time of Claudius forward, this will be one of the places where the emperors live, or at least own, and then the gardens will be largely open to the public. So this will become one of the famous pieces of architecture in Rome, which tells you that Sallust, by some means, had become ridiculously wealthy. So I'm not saying he was corrupt, but I'm saying the odds are actually pretty good that he was corrupt. Not long after the trial, Sallust announced that he was thoroughly disgusted by what had happened. He was disgusted with politics altogether, and so he retired. What exactly that looked like is another question in of itself. Does it mean that he simply quit attending the Senate, or does it mean that he officially resigned from that body? My guess is that he just quit showing up, and then he just wrote about his disgust later. And he might have been stricken from the rolls by a censor at some later time for his non-participation. It's also possible he actually did keep showing up to the Senate and only voted and didn't speak. He became a backbencher. We don't really know, and he doesn't bother to tell us, and no one else does either. What we can say for sure is that he wouldn't run for another office. So again, unlike most politicians, when he said he was retiring, he meant it. He was the anti-Ric Flair. It also seems to be implied that he was claiming that the charges against him were false and he was sick of being accused of things that were fantastical, and so he decided to call it quits while he's still ahead. I tend to think he might have been somewhat guilty of bribery, though, as governor, and so perhaps he merely felt like he was lucky that he had gotten away with it and just wanted to quit while he was ahead. We don't really know. What we do know is that he did get married at this time. Now, most likely, he had been married once or twice already, just based on his age. He would have been around 40 or more by this time. But now he's going to marry a woman who was relatively famous, and that woman is Terentia. She had been married to Cicero for a few decades. They had had 2 children together, both of whom reached adulthood, one of whom, Marcus Tullius Cicero the Younger, was still alive. But they had been divorced around 47 or 46, mostly because Terentia thought that Cicero was a bad manager of money. So she would have been available by the time that Sallust retired. We don't know exactly when they got together, but we don't know that many details about their marriage either. So they got together. Based on what little we do know about Terentia and what we can kind of glean about Sallust's personality, they actually seem to be a pretty good match. Because Terentia, according to Cicero, was someone who was very serious-minded and also someone who's a bit of a penny pincher. So she was always worried about going broke. Sallust clearly did not have those worries because remember, he built an elaborate garden on one of the most exclusive hills in Rome. And so marrying Sallust meant financial security, and Terentia was all about that. She also was good at managing money, so he knew she wouldn't waste his money. He also was of a serious mindset so far as we can tell. So it actually makes sense that they would have been a couple, and they also probably got along fine, just based on the few things we know about each one of them. By the way, at least according to the later St. Jerome, who some people have questioned as someone who understands chronology, but one piece of testimony that he leaves is that Terentia actually would marry a 3rd time after Sallust's death, and then she would go on to live all the way until 6 CE, when she was 103 years old. Whether that's true or not is unknown, of course, but it is interesting, the idea that Terentia lived that long. As for Sallust, he would only live about half as long as his wife, his last wife, because he would die in the year 35 BCE, only 10 years into his retirement, and he was only 51 at the time. So although he was no longer enduring the slings and arrows of public life, or facing the dangers of mutinying legions, or leading armies into battle and all of those risks, he still didn't live very long, and he actually died, as we'll see, in the middle of one of the biggest projects he had worked on to date. So what was Sallust up to after he decided that politics was not his bag after all? Now that he was free from public life, Sallust decided to devote himself to writing history. And he would turn out to be extremely talented at writing history. Most historians of the ancient world would engage in what is known as universal history. They would try to write these very broad, grand narratives where they would try to talk about a massive swath of time, or talk about more or less everything of note that happened between one date and another. But Sallust decided to take a more Thucydidean approach. Thucydides had famously tried to only talk about things relevant to the Peloponnesian War from its outbreak to its end, although of course he would never finish the work because of his premature death. But Sallust decided to take on much smaller issues than the Peloponnesian War, and in fact his first ever known writing project was a historical monograph, the Bellum Catilina, the War with Catiline. So in 63 BCE, Catiline had famously launched his conspiracy. This had occurred when Sallust was in his early to mid-20s, so he would have been too young to participate in the political process, but he would have been well aware of what was happening. By this time, he was already fully educated, and he was well connected. He was building up his reputation and preparing himself for politics. So he most likely did not have to consult that many sources to do this. But one source he would have had on hand, of course, was his new wife, whose husband Cicero had been consul at the time, the consul who dealt with this conspiracy. And so Sallust was able to look at this episode, but he had an agenda, because like most ancient historians, Sallust was very much a moralist. And what he saw in the Catilinarian conspiracy was a perfect example of the corruption and immorality that was at the heart of the Roman Republic in his day. And so he will focus heavily on that, and he also will provide a little bit of distortion at certain points. So while his account is probably better than that of Cicero, because Cicero was writing speeches about it that were designed to turn his audience against Catiline, Sallust's account still has its own biases, because what he does is focus on the morality of the Catilinarian conspiracy rather than a lot of the finer details. And for him, the two main characters are not Catiline and Cicero, but rather Caesar and Cato, at least when this is being debated in the Senate. So as they're debating what to do with the known Catilinarians, the default position was to kill them for their treasonous activities. But then Caesar, the Praetor-elect, made a brilliant speech and argued in favor of imprisoning them throughout Italy. And he made some pretty good points about why that would be a good idea, about the advantages they would gain dealing with their allies and showing mercy and things of that nature. And Caesar had largely carried the day against an audience that didn't really want to hear that, but then Cato fires back. Cato at this time was much more junior, so he was barely into the cursus honorum at all, and then he made a fiery speech demanding, for moral reasons, that these men be put to death. And of course that position carried. Caesar was nearly killed by his colleagues who were now furious at him for proposing such a thing. And for Sallust, who could have only heard about all this secondhand, this was a defining moment in Roman politics, because these were the two great men of his age, as he put it, because both of them represented two diametrically opposed points of view. In many ways, what Cato was arguing is that for the state to stand, for the state to continue to exist, they have to be willing to take actions that might not have material benefit, but are solely done for moral purposes. And so Cato effectively says, yes, Caesar's right about the benefits that will accrue if we spare these men, but if we're true Romans, we will kill them. That's the only way to save the Republic. And so what Sallust was trying to point out is that kind of the Catilinarian era was the last time when the Republic, warts and all, actually did function correctly, at least in his view. And of course, the distortion is that it really exaggerates the importance of both Caesar and Cato at this time. Because again, Caesar had not been praetor yet. Cato was even more far removed from high office. And so there were other senators there who were vastly more important and didn't get any feature in the narrative. Nonetheless, it's still an excellent work. It's very engaging, and it has been something that people have loved ever since it was completed. In fact, I would say it is the go-to source on the Catilinarian conspiracy. The only real competition are the speeches of Cicero on the subject, but those again are even more biased because it's all about Cicero denouncing Catiline and trying to justify killing him. Sallust, by this point, was very firmly committed to moral causation as his sort of theory. That is to say that societies succeed or fail based on their adherence to a moral code. So Sallust decided to reach back a little bit farther into the annals of history, going before his own birth this time, to the War of Jugurtha, the Bellum Jugurthinum, which occurred around 110 BCE and for a few years thereafter. He actually will reach back several years before that to talk about how Jugurtha came to power in Numidia. Jugurtha was actually not the heir apparent, but he had impressed a number of Romans, and he also had impressed his uncle. His uncle had been king, and his direct heirs were grandsons. They were very young, and he thought that they might have a lot of trouble in the world surviving with the Romans around and other threats, and so he had actually divided his kingdom originally between Jugurtha and his grandsons. Over time, Jugurtha had taken advantage of those two young men and annexed their territory. By right, since the two young men were also allies of Rome, and since they were the more rightful heirs, the Romans, from a moral perspective, should have defended their rights and defeated Jugurtha. The problem was that Jugurtha had gone on campaign with Scipio Aemilianus or some other general, and so he had a whole lot of friends in Rome. So many men in Rome liked him, both because of Jugurtha's charisma, but also because Jugurtha was willing to give them gifts. So Jugurtha was buying some men off, winning others over, and the two young men simply couldn't compete. They had not had that experience, they didn't have that talent, they didn't have the charisma. And so Jugurtha, who had inherited the more wealthy part of the country, could outbribe them, outmaneuver them, and so, although there were calls in the Senate to act on these young men's behalf, those calls were never heeded. And by the time that people started to take it seriously enough, well, Jugurtha had gobbled up his nephews, and he was now king in Numidia. And Jugurtha apparently said about Rome that it was a, quote, city for sale, and doomed to fall to the earliest buyer it can find. Ultimately, what would happen is that the populares, who had been kind of on the back foot since the time of the Gracchi brothers, will make a comeback in the time of the Jugurthan War, because they will be able to attack the immorality and corruption of a number of the leading men of the day who failed to deal with Jugurtha vigorously enough. So a number of men will be disgraced by either failing to campaign vigorously enough or by losing to him. And one man in particular, Metellus Numidicus, will go in and start to turn the war around, but again it's an uphill battle because his predecessors were incompetent. He then will show arrogance to his own subordinate Gaius Marius, who's a man who is probably about 10 years behind the Cursus Honorum and wants to run for office, wants to run for the consulship. So Metellus effectively snubs him. Marius then goes and becomes consul anyway, and then gets the people to vote him into his former patron's command. And then Marius runs into difficulties with a young aristocrat, Sulla. And so this was a complex story. Eventually Rome will prevail, but they don't really learn anything from it. So although the war happened because Rome failed to adhere to its own moral standards, that does not make them cleave to those standards in the future. And in fact, it just sets up a lot of conflict going forward. The Roman Republic will learn nothing from this. One other thing that he does here much more than in his previous work is that he really highlights the importance of the personalities. So whereas Caesar and Cato kind of represented ideas almost in the last work, here in the Bellum Jugurthinum, you really get a very strong sense of men like Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, who was this kind of political grifter, this guy who was very good at making people think he was one thing, whereas in fact he was on the other side. Or Gaius Marius, the driven, hungry politician general. Or Metellus, the old money kind of guy who was very much a country club Roman, if you will, someone who was a snob, but also someone who did have some honor and also some ability. And you got Sulla, the arrogant, very much swashbuckling aristocrat. And then Jugurtha, the charismatic, but also wild and arrogant and almost savage ruler. And these personalities drive the narrative because we know that Roman politics was very much personality driven. So in that way, it's a pretty accurate representation, a very lively representation of the politics of this era. The third and final work of the historian Sallust was the Histories, or Historiae. These were written in 5 books and covered the years 78 to 67 BCE. For context, a book is how much could fit on an ancient scroll, and that usually corresponded with around 35 pages printed if you were to translate it and put it into a modern book format. And so, this work was more substantial than the ones before it in terms of its length. It's also not clear whether he intended to write more or whether he was content to just look at this particular range of years. As it stands, this actually is a fairly coherent amount of time to cover. Not only was there a historian who apparently covered the Sullan era, so there was someone who covered the years before this, but also these years were effectively the post-Sullan order. So Sulla as dictator had died, I think, in late 79, and by 78 you see Sulla's successors in charge, and then more or less keeping a handle on things up until 67, which is when their control in Roman politics started to fall apart, and you see the reemergence of the populares. So it actually is a pretty good selection of time. It's not just random. That being said, there's every reason to think that Sallust would have continued it and added more onto it, because most historians who wrote works called the Histories didn't really limit themselves all that much in terms of what they covered. Or it's even possible Sallust instead would then go back in time and cover the events of the Sullan era with his own Sallustian spin. Unfortunately, of course, he would only write the 5 books, and of those 5, we have very little of what was originally there. And that is because most of it has been lost. So unlike the 2 previous monographs, where we have the entirety of them, we only have fragments. And the parts that we have are almost entirely speeches. Now, in most historical narratives written by ancient historians, what they would do is have their major characters deliver speeches before battles or before the Senate. And we don't know exactly how much they could draw upon historical documents when thinking of what these speeches would have been like. So, in some cases, Sallust would have known about the published speeches of Cicero or other people who published their speeches, but sometimes he didn't have access to information like that because nobody had written it down. And so he'd have to make up what these speakers would say. And so what ancient historians would do is they'd think of what a person should have said at that moment. So what would have made sense for them to say, and how could they have said it as well as possible. And so in many cases, the speeches that characters deliver in these histories are the inventions of the authors who are writing the histories. And for people who have a lot of talent as writers like Sallust, this was a real opportunity to show off his rhetorical abilities. And apparently Sallust went all out in these speeches because they really impressed the later rhetorician Quintilian. And he actually excerpted and preserved these speeches for his students to study. And so although Sallust was not as known for his eloquence as, say, a Cicero, because he wasn't as witty or humorous, he still was known for being able to write one hell of a speech, at least when it was in the mouth of some long-dead senator. And so Quintilian was deeply impressed by Sallust's writing, and perhaps the most important of the speeches that Sallust wrote that was preserved, and we still have, was a speech he put into the mouth of the elder Lepidus, the father of the future triumvir, who launched a revolt against the Sullan order in 78. Or was it 77? Either way. The point is, it gave us the perspective of Lepidus, who otherwise is portrayed as just a bad guy. So that in itself is an important contribution. And again, it shows that Sallust was still growing and evolving as a writer. Because if you were an ancient with access to all three of these works, the consensus is that the Historii was the greatest of the three. It was the masterpiece that Sallust produced, the thing that you should aspire to read, the must-read. And unfortunately, it's the one we have the least of now. But we still have some of it, and we can get a good sense of how Sallust was actually evolving and improving as a writer, how his work was becoming more and more eloquent, and had he lived longer, who knows how much more he would have accomplished. But as we mentioned, he unfortunately only spent about 10 years of his life working as a historian. If he had had 20 or 30 years, there's no telling how much he might have written. The three historical works we just discussed are the ones that are by far the most important, but within the literary tradition of Sallust, there are a few others that have been preserved that purportedly are by him. One of them is the invective against Marcus Cicero, and apparently Quintilian, the ancient rhetorician, thought this was real, although most scholars today do not believe that. But this is set around the year 54 BCE, and it is just a bitter speech where Sallust supposedly denounces Cicero. There's a good chance, though, that this was produced later by a student of rhetoric. There was actually a common thing for students of rhetoric to write fake speeches set in famous periods. And so a lot of times, because the late Republic was known for these great political debates and all these large personalities, a lot of students in the imperial period would pretend to be one of these great senators and write a really elaborate speech against someone else. And a lot of times you can tell by the quality of the writing or the vocabulary that might be out of date, or by details and chronology being off, that these are fake. And this is one that doesn't really seem to be real, but there are a few scholars who actually believe it is. One scholar actually believes that this was a pamphlet rather than a speech, and that Sallust published it anonymously, but then perhaps after Cicero's death admitted that it had been him who had published the thing. There's also another related text that goes along with this called the Invective against Sallust, and this is supposedly Cicero's response. But the big problem with this one that makes it even less likely to be real is that, unlike the original that seems to have a specific date, this one refers to events that occurred after 54, such as Sallust getting drummed out of the Senate in the year 50. Given that Cicero was very quick on his feet and was known to be able to respond very much extemporaneously, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense that he would wait 5 or more years to write something like this, or that he'd go after Sallust later on when Sallust was still in good with Caesar and he was not. So would he have really waited for Caesar to be dead to go after a minor figure in Roman politics who had retired in semi-disgrace? I don't know. It seems like a waste of Cicero's time, frankly. And for Sallust, would he really want to go after Cicero, who was known for embarrassing people and verbal jousting, when Sallust, by most accounts, was not really a noted speaker? He was much more of a writer? I don't know. I just don't see that as a wise decision or something that was likely to have happened. Two other works, the speech to Caesar on the state. This is supposedly Sallust delivering a speech to Caesar in front of the Senate, giving him advice. There's also a letter to Caesar on the state, which is just the written version of the same thing, similar topics. Both of these do not seem to be real. They don't really sound like Sallust that much. And also, it'd be unlikely that Caesar would seek out the advice of really that many people, but especially Sallust in this formal way, since they apparently were on pretty good terms. He would not really ask for such a formal advice session. Also, the reason why these exist most likely is, again, it was a rhetorical exercise from a later time, and it's sort of premised on the idea that Sallust was a well-known wise man, that because of his brilliant history writing, everybody at the time must have recognized his genius and sought out his advice. But again, when Sallust was still an active politician, he was someone who mostly didn't do anything all that impressive, and his one major assignment that would have been around the time this was written or spoken, he would have been on the outs. He had just failed miserably as the governor of Africa Nova. And no one knew he was a brilliant historian yet because he had not written his works yet. So no one would have asked him to go before the Senate and give them marching orders because no one thought he was on the level to come up with that many ideas that anyone would really care about. In his own lifetime, it's actually very possible that Sallust was not all that widely read, and that his works were mostly ignored. Perhaps what he had to say hit a little too close to home. It's also possible that he was not well received initially. The only review we know of from early on was by one of his contemporaries, Linnaeus. Linnaeus was a freedman who had served under Pompey, and then had become sort of an advocate of Pompey's legacy. Linnaeus says that Sallust was an ignorant man who didn't understand Latin language properly, and that he was a terrible writer. And to be fair, Sallust was not someone who wrote in Ciceronian Latin. His Latin was much more archaized. And so Linnaeus accused him effectively of being an illiterate, which is a ridiculous criticism. We have to remember Linnaeus was loyal to Pompey, and Sallust actually delivered one of his most famous barbs at Pompey, presumably actually in public as a politician rather than in his writing. But he said of Pompey that he was honest in face, shameless at heart, and this apparently made the rounds and was quoted for many years. And so this created a legacy of bitterness, and Linnaeus had to do his duty and attack the quality of Sallust's writing. But aside from Linnaeus, who of course again had his reasons for doing this, most other people who read Sallust's work later were deeply impressed and thought that Sallust had created masterpieces. What's also interesting is that a lot of his readers were not historians, but they read him for the fun of it, for the experience, for the literary quality of his work. So unlike Linnaeus's claim that the man was illiterate, most later writers of the imperial period thought that Sallust was a brilliant writer. Quintilian, as we mentioned, thought that Sallust was on par with Thucydides, and he made his students learn the speeches out of the histories. Martial, the poet, and Seneca, the philosopher, also quoted his work at various times and said that it was something everyone should read. And all these guys are working in the 1st century CE, so the time of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. There's also Tacitus, who is from the age of the Flavian dynasty, so a little bit after the death of Nero. And Tacitus would become, in his own right, one of the most famous historians that Rome ever produced. In fact, I would say most Roman historians today would call Tacitus the dean of the Roman historians of antiquity. But in Tacitus's words, Sallust was the most illustrious of the Roman historians. And perhaps if imitation indeed is the sincerest form of flattery, we can see that Tacitus drew very heavily on Sallust for inspiration. We can say for sure that Sallust actually does mean this praise, because he very much modeled his own work after Sallust. He did some different things, but for the most part he was trying to be Sallustian as much as possible, at least in terms of how he selected fairly small episodes in his histories. So he just wrote about the year of the 4 emperors, and also tended to be a little bit more terse. Although Tacitus takes it to a whole nother level, but let's not go there for now. That is a different story for a different time. Today, Sallust is still very well regarded by modern scholars. His works are considered to be very well written, so you might encounter him in a Latin language class or in a Roman history class. That being said, because his work is so moralizing, he is not really seen as being on par with Thucydides anymore. Thucydides was much more analytical and cool, Thucydides was much more about human nature and these broader themes, trying to get into why and how civil wars happen and things of that nature, whereas Sallust is much more interested in issues of character and public morality, concerns that I don't think have been in vogue in a while. So Thucydides at this point and also Tacitus are considered to be better than Sallust, but Sallust is still very well regarded and often read by people with an interest in the subjects he wrote about. When we consider the legacy and significance of Sallust, we have to be honest about it. Politically, the man was a failure. Sure, he achieved the rank of praetor, but that was only because Caesar needed senior magistrates who were loyal, and Sallust was around. He didn't really achieve all that much of note, aside from the time he handled logistics in North Africa. It may simply be the case that Sallust was not talented in politics. Other than his one quote about Pompey, we don't really have much other evidence that he ever really did anything notable as a speaker, or passed any legislation, or was a capable military leader. We also have no reason to think that he was all that charismatic. But he found his true calling when he retired and started writing, because his ability as a writer was quite spectacular. He was a great researcher. He could put together a narrative. He knew how to write speeches, even if he probably couldn't deliver them that well himself. And so he created 2 monographs that are enduring masterpieces on the Catilinarian conspiracy and the War of Jagera, and both of those have continued to be our main sources about those 2 important episodes of Roman history. He also, of course, became known as this great master of rhetoric, and even more indirectly, I'm sure that some of the later rhetorical works we might encounter from the Roman imperial period might have been created by people who studied him and may sort of echo Sallust's ideas and his approach. One of the things I think is very important about Sallust that tends to be downplayed, or at least not emphasized enough, is that he's a member of what I see as the key generation for the Civil War period, both of the Caesar Civil War era from 49 to 45 and the Second Triumvirate period. That generation of men who went into that war in their 30s. They weren't quite at the pinnacle of Roman politics, but their participation was needed to keep it going. Men like Mark Antony and Curio and Marcus Caelius and many of the assassins of Caesar. Sallust is of that age range, so he was a member of that generation. And so by reading his works, we can kind of get an insight into that mindset. Because again, these are men who apparently largely all agreed that everything was completely and totally screwed, and that the Republic was failing. We'll see that when we look at men like Curio the Younger and others, that there was a kind of consensus among men of this age range that everything was all messed up. But also, despite the fact that they thought many of their elders were beyond contempt and were immoral and ridiculous, they themselves also got into trouble, and Sallust is also par for the course there. He clearly had the affair with Milo's wife. He went to some ceremonies from a Pythagorean senator and got in trouble for that. He got kicked out of the Senate. And then, of course, he had a couple of military failures as well. And then, as governor, he almost certainly lined his pocket and possibly also lost some battles or failed to properly carry out some of his duties. And so another question that I'll just leave you with, rather than trying to answer, is just how seriously should we take accusations about someone in the late Republic being immoral? Because Sallust very clearly thought that he wasn't the one who was immoral. He thought it was everyone else. And yet, many of his contemporaries thought that he was a degenerate. So, are these accusations of moral turpitude merely a trope? Something that they all accuse each other of? Was there any truth in it? Were they all degenerates? I mean, what's happening here? So that's something that I'd like you to ponder. And if you want to ponder it further, you can always just read Sallust's own works. So this is the one case where we can end a life of a famous Roman, and rather than reading about him, you can go read his own work. So his Two monographs especially are very easily accessible. You can get the more scholarly edition from Loeb, or you can get the Penguin edition, which is pretty good as well. Anyway, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will be seeing you around soon with yet more content about ancient Rome and other topics of great interest.